Why, hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me tonight. Coming at you from beautiful Southern California, where the sun is out, but it's getting lower in the sky. Right, the days are longer, but summer's upon us. Um, there's something about this time of year, right, that makes everything feel more possible, more alive. Unless you live at the equator, and it just feels this way all year round. But I don't live at the equator, so this is my experience of the seasons. Tonight, I wanted to spend some time unpacking the ideas in my latest piece, A Letter to Humanity, which I shared today on Notes from the Circus. Yesterday, I talked about morals, about how we've somehow forgotten the basic lessons we all learned as children, how we've convinced ourselves that moral clarity is naive, that sophistication requires paralysis. I talked about how this moral confusion isn't accidental. It serves the interests of those who benefit from our inability to make clear distinctions between right and wrong. But tonight, I want to go much deeper because what I've realized in writing this letter is that our moral confusion is actually a symptom of something far more fundamental. We're losing touch with what it means to be human in the first place. And more importantly, we're being systematically taught to forget what it is to be human. So, the core insight I want to explore with you tonight is something that, I've referred to as love, as an epistemic force. Now, I know that might sound abstract, but bear with me, because I think this concept is key to understanding both our current crisis and the path forward. When I say love is an epistemic force, I mean that love is fundamentally about how we know things, how we understand reality, how we process information about the world. It's not just a feeling or an emotion, though it includes those things. It's a way of engaging with reality that allows us to perceive patterns, relationships, and possibilities that purely analytical thinking often misses. Think about how you know your closest friend or family member. You have factual information about them, their history, their preferences, their habits. But your deepest knowledge of who they are comes through love, right? Through sustained attention, emotional engagement, the willingness to see them clearly, even when that seeing includes seeing their flaws and contradictions. That's part of who they are, right? There's that truth that you miss even the things you don't like about people when they're gone, right? We've experienced that sort of like contradiction. So thinking about love as an epistemic force allows you to hold complexity without being overwhelmed by it. It lets you perceive the wholeness of a person, even while acknowledging their individual parts. It gives you patience for the slow process of understanding rather than demanding immediate clarity or simple answers. So this capacity, the way of knowing through love, is exactly what we need to navigate the complex challenges of our time. Because it's also exactly what's being systematically eroded by the forces that would optimize us out of existence. So we need to talk about pedagogy, the teaching method. Behind both the letter and everything I'm trying to do at Notes from the Circus. Because how we learn about being human is just as important as what we learn. So traditional education, right? The kind that most of us have received, operates on what's called the banking model. This was coined by like Paulo Freire, again like 19 Brazilian. um, is this idea that information gets deposited into empty vessels. Students receive knowledge from authorities who possess it, and learning becomes this passive consumption rather than active discovery. But moral and existential education can't work that way. You can't teach someone to be human by depositing facts about humanity into their heads. You can only create the conditions where they recognize their own humanity and the humanity of others through direct experience. This is why I don't write like academic papers or policy briefs, right? This is why the circus metaphor isn't just illustration, it's immersion. I'm trying to do what John Dewey called educative experiences. Encounters that transform how you see yourself and your situation, not just what you think about abstract questions. When I describe the circus tent with its leaking seams and its rising floodwaters, when I introduce you to the solitary woman carrying her grief, when I place you in conversation with these historical figures who've grappled with these same questions, I'm not asking you to analyze these scenarios from the outside. I'm inviting you to recognize yourself within them. Because here's the pedagogical insight. You already know what human dignity requires. You learned it through your earliest relationships, in your playground conflicts and family dynamics, in moments of genuine connection or profound betrayal. The knowledge is already there, embedded in your lived experiences. The problem isn't that we lack information about how to be human. It's that we've been systematically trained to distrust our own moral intuitions, to defer to external authorities, algorithms, to believe that our direct experience of what makes life meaningful is somehow naive or insufficient. So my pedagogical approach is what I would call recognition rather than instruction. Instead of talking about what to think, we need to talk about the conditions where you can see clearly what you already know. Instead of providing answers, I'm helping you remember the questions that matter most. This is where love as an epistemic force becomes crucial. Because recognition, the ability to see clearly what you already know, requires the kind of patient, sustained attention that makes love possible. It requires being willing to sit with complexity, to hold contradictions, to let understanding emerge organically rather than forcing premature closure. The analytical mind wants to categorize, to reduce, to break things down into manageable components. I mean, and that has a place, but love as an epistemic force allows you to perceive wholes, to see how parts relate to each other, to understand systems and patterns that pure analysis often misses. This is why the letter ends with the direct challenge. Which, like, if you think I'm getting something wrong here, right? I think now would be a good time for someone to speak, right? Because I'm not positioning myself as the authority who has figured it all out. I'm certainly not that. I'm speaking as one conscious human being to others, sharing what I've discovered through my own process of recognition, inviting you to trust your own capacity for this kind of knowing. But this approach rests on a deeper philosophical foundation. What I would call the recognition that meaning is constructed rather than given. If you've read my stuff, you've seen me say this over and over again. This isn't academic postmodernism or relativistic skepticism. It's like the most practical realism possible about the human condition. We live in a universe that offers us no predetermined purpose, no cosmic instruction manual, no divine authority dictating what lives should mean. The patterns we find, the values we pursue, the significance we create, these emerge from us, from the space between human minds, engaged in the ancient work of meaning making. And here's where love as an epistemic force becomes absolutely essential. Because if meaning is constructed rather than discovered, then the quality of our meaning depends entirely on the quality of our construction process. And love, properly understood, is what ensures that our construction serves human flourishing rather than human diminishment. Think about the difference between a house built with love and care versus one thrown together for quick profit. Both are constructed, but the quality of attention, intention, and the relationship brought to the construction process creates entirely different outcomes. The materials might be the same, but the result is fundamentally different. The same is true for meaning making. When we construct meaning through love, through sustained attention to what actually serves human flourishing, through willingness to hold complexity rather than simplifying it away, through commitment to truth even when it's inconvenient, we create frameworks for living that are robust, beautiful, life-giving. But when we construct meaning through other forces, through fear, through the desire for control, through the pursuit of efficiency above all else, we create frameworks that may be technically functional, but that ultimately diminish rather than enhance human possibility. This recognition is simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it means we're free to construct lives of genuine authenticity, to reject oppressive frameworks that deny our dignity, to create possibilities, new possibilities for human flourishing. Terrifying because it means we're responsible, individually and collectively, for the work that entire civilizations once claimed to do for us. But here, just because meaning is constructed doesn't mean it's arbitrary. We construct within constraints: biological, physical, social, logical. We're not creating meaning from nothing, but from the raw materials of human experience, according to patterns that reflect our deepest needs and highest aspirations. Love isn't meaningful because God commanded it or because evolution programmed it into us. Love is meaningful because conscious beings encountering each other across the fundamental loneliness of individual existence have discovered that genuine connection, the kind that holds difference rather than eliminating it, creates possibilities for flourishing that neither could achieve alone. This is what I mean when I say love is an epistemic force. It's not sentiment or feeling, though it includes those things. It's the fundamental orientation that allows consciousness to engage complexity without being overwhelmed, to navigate difference without destroying relationship, to create significance together rather than surrendering that task to external systems. So let's talk about what this looks like in practice, because I think the concept of love as an epistemic force can sound abstract until you see how it actually operates. Consider how you approach a disagreement with someone you deeply love versus how you approach disagreement with a stranger or someone you dislike. With a loved person, you're naturally curious about their perspective. You assume there's something intelligible behind their position, even if you can't immediately see it. You're willing to ask questions rather than just assert your own view. You're patient with the process of understanding. This is love as an epistemic force in action. It creates conditions where understanding becomes possible, not agreement, understanding. Love doesn't eliminate intellectual rigor. It enhances it by providing the emotional foundation needed for genuine inquiry. Love of the truth. Now, contrast this with how we typically approach political disagreement or scientific debates or economic policy discussions. Too often, we start with the assumption that there are those who disagree with us. Those who disagree with us are stupid, or they're malicious, or they're deluded, out to lunch. We approach the conversation not to understand, but to win. We prioritize efficiency over depth, speed over accuracy, and confirmation over discovery. The result is what we see everywhere around us: discourse that generates heat rather than light, conversations that entrench positions rather than exploring them, intellectual environments that reward quick cleverness over patient understanding. But when we approach complex questions through love as an epistemic force, something different becomes possible. We're willing to sit with uncertainty. We're curious about what we might be missing. We're humble about the limitations of our own perspective while still maintaining confidence in our capacity to learn and grow. This doesn't mean abandoning critical thinking or accepting everything uncritically. Love as an epistemic force is actually more rigorous than purely analytical approaches because it refuses to settle for superficial understanding. It demands we see clearly even when that seeing is uncomfortable or inconvenient. Now here's where this philosophy becomes, I would say this becomes urgently political. Because the same forces that would strip love as an epistemic force from individuals are working to eliminate it from our collective life. Think about how this plays out at different scales. At the personal scale, you're told that algorithms know what you want better than you do, that your preferences, your choices, your judgments are just data points to be optimized, that your capacity for patient understanding is less reliable than metrics designed to maximize engagement or efficiency. Love as an epistemic force gets replaced by algorithmic analysis that can process more information faster but lacks the holistic understanding that comes through sustained relationship. Then there's the relational scale. You're encouraged to approach relationships through apps that reduce human complexity to swipeable profiles, to treat emotional understanding as something to be optimized rather than cultivated, to see the slow work of getting to know someone as inefficient compared to algorithmic matching. Love is an epistemic force. The patient, attentive process of coming to know another person deeply gets replaced by computational compatibility analysis. That's where we are. I wonder why we have a loneliness crisis. And then there's the community scale of this problem. I mean, local decision-making gets transferred to distant experts who have data but not relationship. Community knowledge, the kind that emerges from people who have lived together through multiple cycles of challenge and growth, gets dismissed as anecdotal compared to statistical analysis. Love is an epistemic force. The understanding that comes from caring about a place and its people over time gets replaced by data-driven solutions implemented by professionals who don't have to live with the consequences. Then there's the democratic scale of this. Complex policy questions get declared too technical for public input. Citizens' capacity for thoughtful deliberation, the kind that emerges when people who care about each other try to figure out how to live together, gets dismissed as inefficient compared to expert analysis. Love is an epistemic force, the patient work of democratic communities coming to understand their own needs and possibilities gets replaced by technocratic administration by cognitive elites. And then there's the civilizational scale problem. Human values themselves get treated as optimization problems. Questions about what kinds of lives are worth living get delegated to systems that can process more information than any individual mind, but that lack the capacity for the kind of holistic understanding that emerges from actually living human life. Love is an epistemic force, our collective capacity to understand what serves human flourishing through lived experience of pursuing it gets replaced by algorithmic analysis of behavioral data. So there's a pattern here. At every scale, we're being told that love as an epistemic force is inefficient, unreliable, obsolete. We're being offered sophisticated systems that promise to handle complexity for us at the small cost of surrendering our capacity to understand that complexity through relationship, through care, through the patient attention that love makes possible. This isn't conspiracy. It's the logical extension of a worldview that mistakes information processing for understanding, data analysis for wisdom, computational power for insight. It's what happens when we forget that knowledge and understanding are not the same thing, that you can have access to unlimited information while completely lacking the wisdom that comes from seeing how that information relates to lived human experience. So how does this play out politically? Because I think we're witnessing something unprecedented. The systematic erosion of democratic epistemic capacity, our collective ability to understand our situation such that we can make meaningful choices about it. Democracy doesn't just require institutions, elections, constitutions, checks and balances. It requires citizens who trust their own capacity for understanding complex situations, who believe they can learn what they need to know to make meaningful political choices, who have confidence in their ability to distinguish between leaders and policies that serve the public good versus those that don't. But we're being systematically trained away from this confidence. Every time we're told that political questions are too complex for ordinary understanding, every time expertise gets weaponized against democratic judgment, every time we're encouraged to treat fellow citizens as enemies rather than fellow participants in the experiment of trying to understand how to live together well. And I want to be careful here when I criticize expertise, right? And this is nuanced because obviously expertise is very important. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday, and I talk about this in my piece. Experts can teach us how to build a bridge, but they don't teach us whether we should build the bridge or where to build it. And so this is the nuance that needs to be had about this conversation about experts. I certainly trust, medical science to treat cancer. I don't trust kooks like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., just to be clear. I'm making a very nuanced point here. In fact, the fascist reactionaries are themselves making an argument to expertise that the cognitive elite, should be the ones to make the decisions for us. So they are, in fact, weaponizing this idea, and we have to understand this. And there is some truth to the fact that intellectual gatekeeping in general in academia has been problematic, and we should be honest about that. That's not anti-intellectual. I don't think anyone could suggest that I'm anti-intellectual. That is not the case. But we're told that truth is too complicated for ordinary people to discern through their own sustained attention and care. That determining what's real requires specialized training, access to classified information, or computational power beyond human capacity. This undermines love as an epistemic force by suggesting that the patient, attentive process of coming to understand complex situations is futile for anyone who isn't a credentialed expert. I talked about this phenomenon of cognitive overwhelm. We're flooded with information designed to exhaust our capacity for the kind of sustained attention that love as an epistemic force requires. Every issue gets presented as equally urgent, equally complex, equally beyond resolution through patient understanding. This creates epistemic exhaustion. People give up on trying to understand and instead defer to authorities or retreat into simplified tribal positions. We see this everywhere. We're taught that fellow citizens who disagree with us politically are not people we need to understand, but enemies we need to defeat. This directly attacks love as an epistemic force by making it impossible to approach political differences with curiosity, patience, and good faith that genuine understanding requires. Our access to information gets filtered through platforms designed to maximize engagement rather than understanding. We encounter political information in context designed to trigger emotional responses rather than thoughtful consideration. This replaces love as an epistemic force, which requires calm, sustained attention with algorithmic manipulation of our psychological vulnerabilities. The cumulative effect is the production of what I call epistemic, what you might call like, epistemic pseudo citizens, I guess. People who have access to vast amounts of political information, but who lack the capacity for the kind of understanding that would make that information meaningful. They go through the motions of democratic participation without possessing the cognitive, moral, and emotional capacities that would make that participation substantive rather than merely formal. This brings me to what I see as the most dangerous political development of our time, right? Which we've already mentioned, right? The emergence of these so-called cognitive elites, right, who believe democratic governance is obsolete. Not because they oppose democracy in principle, but because they believe ordinary people lack the epistemic capacity for meaningful self-governance in a complex technological civilization such as ours. This isn't the crude authoritarianism, right, of jackboots and midnight raids, as I said in my letter. This is sophisticated authoritarianism that uses our own limitations against us. It speaks the language of rationality, efficiency, expertise. It promises to solve democracy's problems by reducing democracy's scope. But here's what's crucial to understand. This argument fundamentally misunderstands the nature of democratic knowing. It assumes that political understanding is primarily a matter of processing information analytically, and therefore that those with greater analytical capacity should have greater political authority. I mean, it makes sense. It's almost convincing when you hear it like that. But democratic understanding is fundamentally different. It's not primarily about processing information. It's about understanding how different policies and leaders affect real human lives in real communities over time. And that kind of understanding emerges through love as an epistemic force, through caring about people and places enough to pay attention to how different choices play out in practice. A policy expert might know more about the technical details of healthcare legislation than a working parent. But the working parent knows something the expert doesn't: what it actually feels like to navigate the healthcare system with a sick child, to weigh the costs of treatment against other family needs, to live with the daily anxiety of inadequate health coverage. Both kinds of knowledge matter, but the expert's knowledge is meaningless without the parents, because the whole point of policy is to serve actual human lives. And you can't understand how to serve human lives without love as an epistemic force, without the patient, caring attention to how policies actually affect people. Listen to how this cognitive elite argument develops, right? You have stage one. Stage one of it starts with the fact that complexity requires expertise. Modern policy questions involve technical details that ordinary citizens can't possibly master through analytical thinking alone. Therefore, democratic input should be limited to broad value questions, while technical implementation gets delegated to those with relevant analytical skills. But this misses that ordinary citizens possess a different kind of expertise. Lived expertise, relational expertise, the kind of understanding that comes from actually experiencing the effects of policies over time. From there, it bleeds into the second stage. Values themselves require sophisticated analysis. Questions about justice, equality, freedom involve philosophical complexity that most people haven't been trained to navigate analytically. Therefore, even value questions should be informed by experts in ethics, psychology, sociology, economics. But this misses that values aren't primarily analytical constructs. They emerge from lived experience of what actually serves human flourishing. Love as an epistemic force allows ordinary people to perceive what supports dignity and what undermines it through direct engagement with life's challenges. Which goes to step three, which is that democratic processes are inefficient and often produce suboptimal outcomes. Research shows that people make predictably irrational choices when faced with complex information through purely analytical processing. Therefore, important decisions should be made by those with demonstrated cognitive competence. But this assumes that rational choices are those that maximize abstract metrics rather than those that serve actual human needs. Love as an epistemic force allows people to make choices that may seem irrational analytically, but serve the deeper patterns of human flourishing that analytical thinking often misses. And there's stage 4 of this argument, that democratic participation itself causes harm. Political engagement creates stress, polarization, conflict, where people try to understand complex issues without proper analytical training. This is what the Chinese Communist Party argues, basically. This is their argument. This is where they are. They're at stage 4 of this argument. People would be happier and healthier if freed from the burden of constant political decision-making. Therefore, cognitive elites should handle governance while ordinary people focus on their private lives. But this completely misunderstands the nature of human flourishing. People need to feel capable of meaningful participation in the decisions that affect their lives. Love as an epistemic force creates the conditions where such participation becomes energizing rather than exhausting, meaningful rather than stressful. Each step sounds reasonable in isolation. Each builds logically on the previous one. But the cumulative effect is the complete elimination of love as an epistemic force from our collective life. Not the violent suppression, but through the sophisticated persuasion that this kind or way of knowing is obsolete, inefficient, and dangerous. What makes this particularly insidious is that it operates in this kind of learned helplessness. People aren't forced to surrender their capacity for understanding. They're taught to believe they never possessed it in the first place. This happens through several mechanisms that specifically target love as an epistemic force. Simple moral questions get buried in layers of technical analysis that make people feel unqualified to trust their own understanding. Should public officials profit from their office? Your love-based epistemic sense immediately knows this is wrong. It violates the basic principle that public service should serve the public rather than the servant. But this gets buried under complex discussions of legal technicalities, precedent, the impossibility of determining intent, the need for sophisticated analysis of the financial arrangements. What do the contracts say? And there's this false equivalence we get, right? That every clear moral situation gets matched with a counterexample that creates artificial symmetry. Every instance of corruption gets balanced with another instance that supposedly shows that both sides do it. This systematically undermines love as an epistemic force by making it impossible to trust your direct perception that some things are clearly better or worse than other things. It creates this epistemic chaos, this information environment that gets flooded with conflicting claims, alternate facts, sophisticated misinformation. This isn't designed to make people believe false things. It's designed to make them give up on their capacity for discernment. When everything seems equally uncertain, love is an epistemic force, which depends on patient attention to what actually serves human flourishing, gets overwhelmed, and people defer to external authorities. And then there's the fact that people who disagree politically get systematically dehumanized, making it impossible to approach disagreement through love as an epistemic force. When your neighbors become fascists or communists rather than people you're trying to understand, the possibility of learning from each other disappears. Policy discussions get conducted in specialized jargon, accessible only to insiders. Solutions get presented as technical optimizations rather than value choices. Citizens get treated as consumers of government services rather than participants in self-governance. This makes it impossible to imply love as an epistemic force because the human consequences of policies get hidden behind technical abstractions. The result is citizens who feel overwhelmed, underqualified, and exhausted by political engagement, who gratefully defer to experts, authorities, systems that promise to handle the complexity for them, who mistake surrender of their own epistemic capacity for their acquisition of wisdom. But the crucial insight that connects personal psychology to political reality, the capacities required for meaningful personal relationships are exactly the capacities that are required for meaningful democratic citizenship. And both depend fundamentally on love as an epistemic force. Think about what makes intimate relationships work. You need the ability to understand your partner, not just through what they say, but through patient attention to how they actually live, what actually brings them joy or causes them pain, how they actually respond to different situations over time. This is love as an epistemic force, understanding through sustained, caring relationship rather than through analytical assessment. You need the ability to navigate disagreement without destroying connection. To be curious about why your partner sees things differently rather than just trying to prove them wrong. To approach conflict as an opportunity for deeper understanding rather than as a competition to be won. You need the capacity to forgive without enabling abuse. To see your partner's potential for growth while acknowledging their current limitations. To hold both love and accountability, both acceptance and the encouragement of positive change. These same capacities make democratic citizenship possible. You need the ability to understand fellow citizens through patient attention to their actual lived experience rather than through abstract analysis of demographics or stated positions. You need the ability to approach political disagreement with curiosity rather than hostility. You need the capacity to hold both love for your community and accountability for its leaders. When we systematically undermine these capacities in personal life, when we teach people to defer to algorithmic recommendations rather than developing their own understanding, to optimize relationships rather than building them through sustained attention, to avoid conflict rather than learning to navigate it through love as an epistemic force, we're simultaneously undermining their capacity for democratic participation. This is why the crisis feels so total, so overwhelming. It's not just that our political system is broken. It's that we're being systematically stripped of the human capacities that could fix it. This brings me back to love as the center, not of the personal flourishing, but of political possibility. Because love as an epistemic force is exactly the capacity we need to rebuild democratic civilization. Love as an epistemic force allows us to see fellow citizens as full human beings with complex motivations and real struggles rather than as political abstractions or tribal enemies. It gives us patience for the slow work of understanding why people support policies we disagree with rather than the quick satisfaction of dismissing them as stupid or evil. Love as an epistemic force helps us distinguish between leaders who demonstrate genuine care for the communities they serve, evidenced by how they actually live, how they treat people when they think no one is watching, how their policies affect real families over time, and those who perform care while serving primarily themselves. Most importantly, love as an epistemic force allows us to hold the tension between trusting people enough to participate in self-governance while maintaining enough critical thinking to hold leaders accountable. Between having faith in democratic possibility while acknowledging democratic failure, between working for justice while practicing forgiveness. The politics of love isn't naive idealism. It's the hardest possible realism about what human cooperation requires. It's the recognition that sustainable power must be built on genuine consent, that lasting institutions must serve human flourishing, that effective governance must engage rather than bypass citizen capacity for understanding. But love as an epistemic force in politics requires us to slow down, to pay attention, to resist the pressure for immediate judgments and quick solutions. It requires us to approach political questions the way we would approach our most important personal relationships, with patience, curiosity, and the willingness to be changed by what we discover. So, what would education look like if it aimed to develop rather than undermine love as an epistemic force? What would it mean to prepare people for conscious citizenship rather than efficient consumption? Teaching people to slow down, to pay sustained attention, to resist the pressure for immediate judgment, showing them how depth of understanding emerges from patient engagement rather than quick analysis. This isn't about meditation in any formal sense. It's about developing the capacity for the kind of sustained attention that love as an epistemic force requires. I mean, it needs, I think we need relational learning, creating educational environments where understanding emerges through relationship rather than information transfer, where students learn to approach complex questions the way they approach getting to know a new friend, with curiosity, patience, and the assumption that there's something valuable to discover. I think it requires embodied understanding, helping people recognize that they know things through their whole being, through emotion, intuition, physical sensation, relational experience, not just through analytical thinking, teaching them to trust and to refine those broader capacities for knowing rather than dismissing them as subjective or unreliable. It requires community-based learning, creating opportunities for people to understand complex issues through direct engagement with the effects on real communities over time, showing them how to listen to the lived experiences of people affected by different policies, how to perceive patterns that emerge from sustained attention to how communities actually function. I mean, it certainly requires moral imagination, which is to say, developing people's capacity to envision alternatives, to see how things could be different, to hold both realistic assessment of current limitations and genuine hope for transformation. This requires love as an epistemic force because it demands the ability to see the potential that doesn't yet exist, but that could emerge through conscious collective effort. It requires democratic practice, creating regular opportunities for people to engage in genuine democratic deliberation, not debate designed to win, but conversation designed to understand, teaching them how to approach disagreement with curiosity rather than hostility, how to build understanding across difference, how to make collective decisions that honor both individual dignity and collective welfare. This isn't about indoctrinating people into particular political positions. It's about developing the capacities that make meaningful political choice possible in the first place, capacities that all depend on love as an epistemic force. This isn't just another political crisis that will resolve itself through normal democratic processes. This is a crisis of democratic epistemic capacity itself, a systematic assault on our collective ability to understand our situation and make meaningful choices about it. The forces driving this assault aren't necessarily malicious. Many genuinely believe they're solving problems, improving outcomes, making life better. But they're optimizing for the wrong things. They're treating human understanding as a bug in the system rather than the whole point of the system. And they're succeeding. Look around. How many people do you know who feel capable of understanding complex political issues through sustained attention and care? Who trust their own capacity to discern what actually serves human flourishing? Who believe that patient, loving engagement with difficult questions is worthwhile? Who maintain hope that collective understanding can emerge through democratic process? We're producing generations of people who are sophisticated information consumers, but incompetent in understanding, who can navigate complex technological interfaces, but feel helpless when asked to think through complex human questions, who have strong opinions about entertainment, but defer to experts on everything that matters for their actual lives. This is how democracy dies in the 21st century. Not through violent coups, but through the gradual erosion of the human capacity for the kind of understanding that makes democracy meaningful. Not through the elimination of elections, but through the production of electorates incapable of love-based knowing that democratic choice requires. But here's the hope I'll leave you with tonight, because I think we need some hope, right? Because recognizing the scope of the problem also reveals the scope of our power to address it through love as an epistemic force. Every choice you make to understand someone through patient, caring attention rather than quick analytical judgment is a political act. Every decision to approach conflict with curiosity rather than hostility is a contribution to democratic capacity. Every moment you choose sustained relationship over algorithmic mediation is a form of resistance that would optimize us, it's a form of resistance to the forces that would optimize us out of existence, I should say. This isn't metaphorical. The personal really is political in the most concrete sense. When you practice love as an epistemic force in your intimate relationships, when you take the time to understand your partner's perspective rather than just asserting your own, when you approach their struggles with curiosity rather than judgment, you're developing the exact skills needed for democratic citizenship. When you learn to disagree with family members without destroying relationship, when you can hold both love and accountability, both acceptance and encouragement of positive change, you're mastering the balance required for healthy political discourse. When you choose depth over efficiency in your friendships, when you prioritize understanding over quick agreement, when you're willing to be changed by what you discover about people rather than just confirming what you already thought, you're modeling the values that could transform our entire approach to collective decision making. Think about how this scales. When you refuse to reduce people to their utility, when you engage with the full complexity of humanity through love as an epistemic force rather than analyzing them as problems to be solved, you create spaces where others can do the same. When you model the capacity to understand before seeking to be understood, you give permission for more thoughtful discourse. When you demonstrate that love as an epistemic force can coexist with intellectual rigor, that caring deeply doesn't mean thinking less clearly, you challenge the false choice between emotion and reason that paralyzes so much contemporary discussion. This is what I mean when I say the pedagogy of recognition. You're not just learning to understand more clearly yourself. You're creating conditions where others can remember their own capacity for this kind of knowing. You're not just developing personal epistemic capacities, you're modeling democratic possibilities. Headphones are not on, right? Every workplace where you insist on understanding colleagues as full human beings rather than human resources becomes a laboratory for more humane economic organization. Every community meeting where you practice love as an epistemic force, where you listen for what people actually need rather than what they're supposed to want, becomes training for democratic deliberation. Every conversation where you hold both truth and compassion becomes evidence that political discourse doesn't have to choose between clarity and kindness. This connects to a deeper philosophical point about how understanding actually happens. The dominant model treats knowledge as something that occurs through individual analysis. Accumulate enough information, apply enough analytical intelligence, and understanding emerges. But love as an epistemic force reveals a different model. Understanding as an emergent property of relationship. The deepest insights don't come from individual thinking, but from the space between minds engaged in genuine inquiry together. Think about your own experience. When have you had your most profound realizations? Usually not when you were alone thinking analytically, but in conversation with someone who cared enough to ask good questions, to challenge your assumptions, to help you see patterns you'd been missing. This is love as an epistemic force in action. Understanding that emerges from the quality of relationship between inquiring minds rather than from the computational power of individual brains. So the kind of change we need, the restoration of human understanding as the foundation of collective life, can't be imposed from above through better policies or more sophisticated systems. It has to emerge from below, from millions of individual choices to engage with reality through love as an epistemic force, rather than surrendering that capacity to external authorities. This doesn't mean ignoring institutional politics or pretending individual choices can substitute for collective action. It means recognizing that sustainable institutional change requires cultural foundation. Populations of people who possess the capacity for love as an epistemic force, who can understand complex situations through sustained attention rather than analytical shortcuts, who trust their own capacity for discernment while remaining open to learning from others. Which brings me to something I've been hesitant to name directly, but I think there's some time. Getting up on an hour, but there is a spiritual dimension to this work that we can't ignore. I'm not talking about religion in any traditional sense. I'm talking about the recognition that love as an epistemic force connects us to something larger than individual consciousness. When we understand through sustained caring attention, we're participating in a kind of knowing that transcends the boundaries of the isolated self. Think about the moments when you've understood something deeply, not just intellectually grasped it, but really seen it clearly. There's often a quality of revelation, of receiving insight rather than producing it, of participating in understanding rather than controlling. This is what happens when love as an epistemic force is fully engaged, when we become permeable to reality in ways that purely analytical thinking doesn't allow. We open to patterns and possibilities that emerge from relationship rather than individual cognition. When we defend love as an epistemic force against systems that would replace it with algorithmic analysis, we're engaging in what can only be called sacred work. When we insist that the patient, caring attention that love makes possible is actually a more reliable guide to truth than computational processing of data, we're making a spiritual claim about the nature of reality itself. This isn't about believing in God or subscribing to a particular metaphysical doctrine. It's about recognizing that consciousness creates possibilities for understanding that didn't exist before consciousness emerged. That love as an epistemic force is a real capacity in the world, not just subjective experience, but a way of accessing truth that purely analytical approaches cannot reach. The systems that would optimize us out of existence don't just threaten our political freedoms or economic interests. They threaten something deeper. The very possibility that love can be a way of knowing, that sustained attention can reveal truth, that caring about something or someone can actually enhance rather than compromise our understanding of it. This is why the pedagogical approach matters so much, because how we teach people about their capacity for understanding fundamentally shapes what becomes possible. If we teach them that our perception is unreliable, that understanding requires special training they don't possess, that love-based knowing is just subjective bias, we produce epistemic helplessness. If we teach them that the way of understanding through relationship and sustained attention doesn't count as real knowledge, we produce intellectual submission. But if we teach them to recognize and trust their capacity for love as an epistemic force, to understand that their ability to perceive what serves human flourishing through sustained caring attention is actually a sophisticated form of intelligence, then we produce something different. Not naive confidence in their own infallibility, but what I call epistemic courage. The willingness to engage complex questions through love as an epistemic force while remaining open to learning and growth. This is what my letter attempts to do. It doesn't promise easy answers or claim love-based knowing never makes mistakes, but it does insist that this capacity matters, that it provides access to truths that purely analytical approaches miss, that it creates conditions where collective understanding becomes possible. There's something else happening that gives me hope. Epistemic awakening seems to be contagious. When someone chooses to engage reality through love, when they slow down enough to really understand rather than just analyze, when they approach complexity with patience rather than reductive simplification, it creates space for others to do the same. I see this in the responses to my writing. People don't just read these ideas, they recognize them. They say, yes, I've been sensing this too, but I couldn't name it. They start approaching conversations differently, listening more deeply, trusting their own capacity for understanding through sustained attention. They begin experimenting with this in their daily lives. Instead of rushing to judgment about their teenager's behavior, you take the time to understand what's really happening beneath the surface. Instead of dismissing their coworkers' concerns as irrational, they listen carefully. to perceive the genuine issues being raised. Instead of getting defensive when their partner criticizes them, they could become curious about what they might be missing about their own impact. Each person who makes this shift creates space for others to consider it, not because they've become evangelists for a particular doctrine, but because they become living examples of different possibilities for knowing and understanding. They prove that you can approach complexity with love rather than analysis and actually understand it more clearly, not less. This is how epistemic transformation actually happens, not through grand educational reforms imposed from above, but through what, Margaret Mead called small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens, choosing to engage reality through love as an epistemic force and discovering that such engagement is both possible and infectious. But this brings us back to the urgency I mentioned in the letter, because while I believe this kind of transformation is possible, I also believe the window for it is finite. Not because of some predetermined timeline, but because the systems that would replace love as an epistemic force with algorithmic analysis are advancing rapidly. Each day, more of our understanding gets mediated by recommendation systems that claim to know what we need to know better than we do. Each day, our relationship gets filtered through platforms designed to maximize engagement rather than understanding. Each day, our collective decision-making gets shaped by forces that profit from our confusion and exhaustion. There's a tipping point beyond which it becomes much harder to remember what we're losing because we've lost the experiential foundation for comparison. If whole generations grow up never experiencing unmediated understanding, never practicing sustained attention as a way of knowing, never developing the capacity for love as an epistemic force, then the restoration of these capacities becomes not just difficult, but nearly impossible. This is why this is urgent, not because we have to solve everything immediately, but because we have to maintain the conditions where understanding through love remains possible. We have to preserve what some like Borgman, I think, called focal practices, like activities that develop human capacities for knowing rather than replacing them with technological substitutes. Reading books slowly rather than consuming content quickly, having conversations aimed at understanding rather than exchanging information efficiently, spending time in natural environments that require patient attention rather than immediate gratification, engaging in civic life through sustained relationship rather than consuming political entertainment. These aren't just lifestyle choices, they're forms of resistance to the systemic replacement of love as an epistemic force with algorithmic processing. They're ways of maintaining capacities that technological civilization tends to erode. They're practices that keep alive possibilities for understanding that pure optimization would eliminate. This is where this philosophy becomes practical. Because understanding through love is only meaningful if it leads to action aligned with that understanding. So my letter ended with a direct challenge, because I believe we're at a moment where knowledge without action becomes complicity. When you see clearly how love is being systematically undermined, when you understand the stakes involved, when you recognize your own role in either supporting or resisting these trends, neutrality becomes impossible. This doesn't mean everyone has to become a political activist or a social movement organizer, but it does mean everyone has to choose consciously and repeatedly whether their daily practices develop or erode their capacity for understanding through love. It means asking yourself, do my information consumption habits develop my capacity for patient understanding or make me more reactive and superficial? Do my relationships model the kind of sustained attention that allows deep knowledge to emerge? Do my work practices contribute to environments where people are understood as full human beings or reduced to their functional utility? Do my civic engagements approach complex questions through love as an epistemic force or through analytical shortcuts that miss essential human dimensions? These aren't abstract moral questions. They're practical inquiries about how to live in alignment with your deepest understanding of what makes knowledge possible. They're ways of ensuring that your private choices support your public commitments, that your personal practice develops capacities needed for collective wisdom. One thing I've learned from sharing these ideas is that developing love as an epistemic force can't be done in isolation. The capacities we need, the ability to understand through sustained attention, to hold complexity without analytical reduction, to remain curious about perspectives that challenge our own, these develop best in community with others who share the commitment. This is why I keep writing, why I keep engaging in these conversations. Not because I have all the answers, I certainly don't, but because the questions are too important to explore alone. Because the work of understanding reality through love requires mutual support, shared inquiry, collective practice. The letter is an invitation to join that community of practice. Not a formal organization with membership requirements, but a loose network of people who've decided to prioritize understanding over analysis, depth over speed, the patient work of knowing through love over efficient processing of information. You recognize each other not through shared conclusions, but through shared commitment to the process itself. Through the willingness to approach complex questions with the kind of sustained, caring attention that love makes possible. Through the humility to remain curious about what you might be missing, combined with the confidence to trust your own capacity for understanding. Finally, I'll say something about patience. Because the urgency is real. And the development here of a movement is necessarily long-term work. The capacities we need to cultivate, the relationships we need to build, the institutions we need to transform, these require time, practice, persistence. The letter represents what I hope is the beginning, not an end, a way of naming what many of us have been sensing, a framework for understanding our situation, a foundation for the deeper work ahead. That work happens at every scale simultaneously. In our intimate relationships where we practice the skills of understanding through sustained attention that make democratic wisdom possible. In our communities where we experiment with approaches to collective decision-making that honor both expertise and lived experience. In our economic life where we create alternatives that to the model of reducing people to data points, or in our political engagement where we work to restore genuine democratic capacity for understanding complex issues. But it all starts with the recognition that love is not just an emotion, but a way of knowing, that sustained, caring attention reveals truths that analytical processing misses. The soft capacity for understanding through relationship is actually the foundation for everything we care about. The world will continue trying to convince us that this is an obsolete way of thinking, that it's inefficient, unreliable. The pressures towards algorithmic mediation of understanding, towards analytical shortcuts that bypass the slow work of patient attention, these aren't going away. If anything, they're likely to intensify. But we can choose something different. We can choose to develop our capacity for understanding through love. We can choose to trust our ability to perceive what serves human flourishing through sustained attention, rather than surrendering that capacity to systems that promise greater efficiency. That choice, made by enough people in enough places, becomes a cultural force. It becomes a political movement. It becomes the foundation for institutions that serve human wisdom rather than replacing it with computational power. This is the revolution we need. Not violent overthrow of existing systems, but conscious development of human capacities that make any system worth having in the first place. Not the rejection of expertise, but the integration of analytical knowledge with the understanding that emerges through love. The letter is my contribution to that development. I mean, these conversations are part of it. Your own experiments in approaching reality through sustained caring attention are part of it. So we can restore love as a force to its rightful place at the center of human understanding. Together, we can resist the systematic replacement of wisdom with information processing. Together, we can model what it looks like to know through love rather than analyze through algorithms. The future depends on whether enough of us remember that understanding is fundamentally relational, that truth emerges through sustained attention rather than quick analysis, that love is not the enemy of knowledge, but its deepest foundation. So, what challenges do you see? Like how might we support each other in developing our capacity? I mean, everyone needs to be thinking about this, because that's what this is, practice. The most important practice of our time, the practice of knowing reality through sustained caring attention rather than surrendering that capacity to systems that promise greater efficiency at the cost of wisdom itself. So thank you. Thank you for being part of this. Thank you for caring enough to think deeply about how we actually understand what matters most. Thank you for whatever experiments in love you're already undertaking in your own life. The center holds because we choose to understand it through love rather than analyze it through algorithms. And tonight, in this conversation, in this shared commitment to knowing through sustained attention, we're practicing that understanding together. The sun has set here in Southern California, but something is rising too, right? The recognition that we still possess capacities for understanding that no system can replace, that love as an epistemic force remains available to us, that the patient work of knowing through relationship is not just possible, but essential. That's a real hope. Not that we'll solve everything quickly, but that we'll remember how to understand deeply. And from that understanding, everything else becomes possible. So, that was what we had today at Notes from the Circus. Yesterday, I talked about morals, about how we forgot about those basic lessons, and tonight I think we close the circle on this. And I've been talking for a very long time. It was a lot. But I want to thank everybody for taking the time, for the sustained attention. Thanks, everybody. And we'll do this again. And I think we'll try to aim for Q&A in the next one. But I have run out of time tonight. So thank you, everybody, and have a good week and have a happy Memorial Day.